2 hours, 30 minutes, road course racing. A shortened race, but it's still going to be a good one. Live from Daytona, Matthew Campton, fastest driver in practice. He's still starting up front. And Nick Green is making his return. He's in the 12 this weekend. He was also quick in practice. Let's see where your favorite drivers are starting. In row 1, we have Kellen Sheff and Luke Dockery. Then it's Alita Dean and Cole Flick. Then it's going to be Matthew Campton, Nick Green. Then we get to Ryan Calloway. And, of course, the one, the only, Abshar Khan. We get to Paige Soper and Maya Dimick. Then we have Quentin Sheff and Penn Pearson. Then we get to the 63 of Allie Brosman. Then we get to Garrett Irwin. After Irwin, we get to Landon Gillett and Braden Mills. Rounding out the rest of the field, it's Boston Matthews, David Loudon, Skylar Naney, Jordan Spencer, Austin Horner, Jonathan Stevenson, Cohen Moore, Quavi Rader, Eli Jackson, Grady Broughton, last week's winner, Cam Reich. Then we get to Bailey Winstead, Nate Rao, Rodrigo Bettina Romo, and Riley Poindexter. We are live here from Daytona, and we are green at Daytona. It's a hot night here from the Daytona Road Course. Here comes Campton. Look at everybody. Down turn 1 and into the infield. 3 wide behind the side-by-side battle for second. Here comes Flick. He went second on the 51, and the 51 is still there. And they're still racing side-by-side. Great racing indeed. Contact made with the 32 and 50. And here comes Matthew Campton. Campton wants the lead. Campton wants fourth. And they get slow. Campton won in third, but he can't take it away. As we see a lot of side-by-side racing through the field. 3 wide, right back here. Poindexter is in last right now as we go back up front. Single file, first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. Flick is up to fourth, and Campton is back to fifth. But here comes Campton. Great run in the 51, trying to take the lead away. And we're trying to take fifth away. Here comes the 51. Through the tri-oval now. Entering turn number 1. The road course section. Aaliyah Dean. She almost won here a few years ago. She's been quick on this road course. Remember, we have 2 hours of racing here. It's a long race indeed. You see Campton running in fifth. We go back up front. It's all Kellen Sheff who leads on lap 2. As we go to the back of the top 10 here. How many spots did Nick Green lose? Nick Green, after starting top 10, has fallen all the way back to 27th. He lost his cool suit last week in the 51, and that was at Dubai. And he had to race without a cool suit. He got taken to a local hospital in Dubai for some IVs, but he was okay after that, and he was cleared to race in this one. Back up front, it's all Kellen Chef who leads. Here we go. Dre Racing still, Campton still trying to move forward, but can't. Car on pit road. Cars on pit road. Green, Tino Romo, and others are all on pit road. As we are still seeing Dre Racing on lap 3. Here we go. Chef leads. Kellen Chef leads onto the oval turn 1. Through the oval turn 1 and 2 this time. A 5/10 in the second lead. He's been good, but here comes Kellen Chef. Luke Dockery, he gets sideways just a bit. Don't be shocked if on the long run that 51 moves through the field. That 51 showed some speed in practice. Quickest car on the track by 4/10 over Kellen Chef, and now here he is, running in 5th. Pit stops will be a thing. You can see the brake rudders glowing in the 50s now to the rear end of the 11. The 51 is there as well to the back end of the 32. Canton trying to move forward. A lot of drivers in the back of the field has heavy damage. So we see a ton of passing going on here. Nate Rao is on pit road, and Nick Green is running last. Why am I not shocked? He's way behind. Contact with the 74. Stevenson almost goes around. The 12 is still running in last as Luke Dockery takes the lead away on lap 4. Nolan Bernango won in Sonoma in that car. And now he wants to get the win. Here we go through the final corner. Here comes Dockery. Luke Dockery is going to lead a lap at the Daytona Road Course. Great racing on lap 5. Still 2 hours left. Contact made. The 14 makes contact with the leader. Side by side for 5th. Callaway and Campton were side by side, but Campton keeps 5th. As it's still all Luke Dockery on lap 5. Still in the infield section. Here comes Chef to the inside. It's side by side for the lead. Dockery gets off the track just a bit. And he's still racing side by side. Dockery through the inside. Loses the lead to Chef. But for how long? Helen Chef is back up front. And Nick Green is still running in last. He's way behind. As you see Matthew Campton running in 5th. He was the fastest car in practice. So no wonder he's running top 5 right now. 2 hours of racing here in Daytona. This should be a fun one. Kellen Sheff and Luke Dockery have both dominated this one. We are going to a short break here right now, as we will be riding along with Matthew Campton. as the sun continues to set over Daytona. We have an hour left of racing. 1 hour left of racing. Paige Soper right now is in the best position to win here. Maybe 1 hour, 34 minutes left. We've seen some good racing, and I'm sorry I was out for a while. I was just tired there, but now I'm back. Here comes the 65, Gilliatt. He continues to lead here in Daytona onto lap 32. So with an hour left, Matthew Campton runs in 23rd. Riley Poindexter runs in last. Nick Green is in 29th. I'm happy he's not in last anymore. I'm honestly really shocked he's not. Soper is in 6th. Jeff 7th. Flick 8th. Rao 9th. Then it's going to be Callaway, Dockery, Irwin, Hahn, Winstead, Bailey Winstead in a position to get back into the running to make the playoffs. She is currently in the running to get into the playoffs, but right now she might lose points. But how about this? She is running up front. Top 10 position for her? Like at the end of this race? Maybe. Here we go. Gilliatt continues to dominate. How about Paige Soper looking for her first career win? Here comes the 27. She is in 3rd as Gilliatt continues to lead. And how about Eli Jackson there in 2nd as well? Gilliatt has looked strong. He already has a win this year. So if he wins, we will see yet another driver make it into the playoffs on points. How many drivers on points will we see in the playoffs at the end of this regular season next week? We know for a fact Matthew Campton is going to be sitting out of the race next week. Unless he wins here, today will be his last race of the season that he's going to be in the field. I'm talking about Matthew Campton. We will expect Ray Green to drive the 51 next week in Road America. And we know for a fact that no matter what, even if Nolan Farley is, if Nolan Farley's number 2 is not racing, and if one of the Team Penske cars like the 22 or the 12 are racing, if only one of them is racing, he will be in that car. As we know, Team Penske has said, hey, we want Nolan to win the regular season championship. Nolan has a good chance of doing so. Let's take a look at the points. As it's still Gilliatt who leads on lap 34. An hour and 30 minutes left. And here we go. I'm going to the points right now. It was just updated today. Farley is 10 points back from the points leader, Riley Poindexter. Bailey Winston is 35 points back. Jordan Spencer is 50 points back. Nolan Farley could drop out of the top 5 after this race. We know that Austin Horner is racing today. We know that he's probably going to make it back to the championship. But right now, we are seeing great racing. And as it's turning out to be right now, Bailey Winstead might have the points lead after today's race. And it depends on where Austin Horner finishes. Right now, she is way in front of Austin Horner. Austin Horner is in 23rd. Winstead, she is running in 9th. And that would be good points for Bailey Winstead. Here comes Gilliott through the final few corners. As we have the 38 looks like that he just pitted here. Aaliyah Deed is in 10th. The 38 just exited pit road. Riley Poindexter will for sure lose her points lead. The points after the Daytona road course will be all jumbled up. This race next year might be earlier in the year, and there's a rumor that they might be racing for 24 hours in a few seasons. If that's the case, 24 hours of Daytona might be coming back. That could be something. I mean, not 24 hours, like 23 or 22 hours of Daytona. That would be interesting. We would see some chaos in that one. We have had 24 hours racing before, and many times we have seen surprise winners. And in the next few seasons, that might be coming back. As we see the 65 continuing to lead here in Daytona. But he is going down low. He's going to pit, which means Paige Soper is going to take the lead away. And in her first few starts with Pat Green Motorsports in the 4, she was quick. No luck on her side, and now she has luck. Will she be able to win here in Daytona, though? She has the lead. This would be crazy. We are going to see 4 drivers make it into the playoffs on points. Why? Because we have had 2 multi-time winners this season.
The best and most realistic motorsports simulator.
Soper continues to lead here in Daytona. Here we go, Soper through the oval turn 2 now. Here she is, continuing to lead, 14-second lead over Cole Flick in second and Luke Dockery in third. Winstead pitted. Okay, yeah, Bailey Winstead just pitted. She is still in front of Riley Poindexter here. Still seeing great racing as we see the 51 back up to 13th. That's Matthew Campton. as it's all Paige Soper right now on lap 37. Flick in second, about Dockery in third. Still great racing about Dimmick. Myatt Dimmick in seventh. Jonathan Stevenson is in eighth. Penn Pearson in ninth. And Grady Broughton in 10th. Some shocking top 10 runners right now. That could shake up the points even more, as it's Paige Soper on lap 37. 10 minutes have gone by as we will be back after the break, and this time we will ride along with Paige Soper. She has a roof cam. We are about 35 minutes away from throwing the checkered flag, and it is all Luke Dockery, Kellen Chef, Paige Soper, Jonathan Stevenson, Mayan Dimmick, and, of course, Matthew Campton in the top 6. The 11 already won a race this year, but right now, the 11 of Dockery is trying to get his first win of the year, and the 11 second win of the year. This would not be a multi-time winner if he were able to win. Now here we go. Here comes Chef to the inside. They make contact. Leaders make contact, and Soper is there right behind Chef. 34 minutes left. Can Luke Dockery get to victory lane here from Daytona? This would be such a special win for him. 35 minutes left. How about the 14 right behind him? What will Chef do? He goes low. Side by side for the lead through the bus stop. Chef goes back up front here in Daytona. How about Stevenson running in 4th? And Riley Poindexter running in last. Nick Green is riding back in 28th as the sun has completely gone down. Here we go. Chef, on lap 65, continues to lead with 33 minutes left. Who's gonna win this? Who's gonna win this one? Here comes a 14. Now we're through the little short shoot there, and now battle for second. Soper to the top. Soper has a fast car. She is showing speed, and she's gonna take second away around the outside. Soper to second, and is now gonna track down our leader, Kellen Chef. Paige Soper could very well get her first career win here tonight. Matthew Campton running in 8th right now. Behind Broughton and Callaway and Maya Dimmick. Question is, what will the point shake out to be after this race? That's a good question. Here we go. Here comes Soper. She goes to the top. Leaders make contact. Here we go again. Here comes Chef. He continues to lead on lap 66. Now down to the inside. Here comes Soper. Oh, she just lunged it up to the inside of Chef. It looks like that she's going to try to take the lead. She's going to be on the outside. She's going to take it away on lap 66. But it's still going to be really close. But right now, it's all Soper now who takes the lead. Here comes Dockery now. He won second as the 14 is winning the lead. It's a good battle up front, while the rest of the cars, fourth on back, are in kind of their battle of the, eighth on back are in their own battle as the gap from third to fourth is only separated by one lap car. By only one lap car, and Stevenson is there in fourth. Soper continues to lead here from Daytona. 29 minutes remaining. Anything can happen, and I know that there will be pit stops. So when pit stops happen, that could change. That could switch everything up. Here comes a 14. Great run by the 14. Still cannot get the lead though this lap. Soper, 2 laps ago, she was just making the pass for second, and a lap ago, she just made the pass for first. As we are about 28 minutes out from throwing the checkered flag. We still have a bunch of time left before the checkered flag hits. We will see multiple drivers pit. But that's it. Pit stops and then a clear straight shot to the end of the race. Landon Gilliott might not even pit. He's in 10th. If Landon Gilliott gets the win here, it would be his second win of the year, and we would see 5 drivers make it into the playoffs on points. We know for a fact that Riley Poindexter and Austin Horner are most likely going to clinch playoff spots if there is a multi-time winner. Farley would not clinch a playoff spot if there is a multi-time winner, only because of points. Only because of his point situation right now. And he's not even racing. And there's some drivers that could gain ground. Like Luke Dockery could be back into the running to make the playoffs on points. Even the 27, even if she doesn't win. A lot of points are being awarded tonight. As we see the 74 there as well. That's Stevenson, as he's probably about to get passed by a lap car. Stevenson, though, around the outside, still is able to hang on to that spot in front of the lap car, as you see Matthew Campton running in 6th. We know he announced that this is going to be his last race of the year if he doesn't win, because if he wins, then he has to race in the championship race. But yeah, next week is the last race of the regular season, and in 2 weeks, we have the championship race from Germany. Now it's a battle between the top 2, as Dockery lost so much ground. It's only a battle between first and second. Here comes a 14 to the top. The 14 went to the top. Couldn't take the lead away. We will see one last break. And that's going to be coming up like here in a few minutes. Here in a few seconds. But once we get out of that break, then it should be a clear shot to the checkered flag. Let's ride along with Matthew Campton. We are 15 minutes away from throwing the checkered flag. Mills in second. We are seeing great racing, folks. Over till it's over. How about Writing in 5th and 6th? How about the 14 Chef is in 6th? Behind Maya Dimmick, who still needs to pit. We are still seeing great racing. The top 2 will need to pit. And Luke Dockery is going to have a 5-second lead over Paige Soper. It's going to be interesting to see if Soper can close the gap in in less than 15 minutes. I think she will be able to, and she is closing the gap. It's now a 5-second gap. It was a 4-second gap. It just grew. Now it's a 4-second gap and closing. On pit road, that's Maya Dimmick. It's gonna be very interesting, to say the least, to see where the 11 is going to be en route of the 27. There's the 11 now exiting that corner as the 27 is now exiting that corner. It's a 4-second lead, and she can see Luke Dockery right in front of her. But Landon Gilliott leads with 13 minutes left. The top 2 will most likely pit this lap and the next time by. It's been a very intriguing pit strategy race, to say the least. Here comes Gilliott round the final corner. He's not pitting this time, but the 3 is. The gap will close from 3rd to 4th. But it's Landon Gilliott on lap 13 who continues to lead. He will have to pit soon. But once the leader pits, nobody else in the running will have to pit. That's the good thing. Nobody else in the top 10, once the leader pits, they don't have to pit anymore. The gap has closed. From 2nd to 3rd, there is Paige Soper, and there is Luke Dockery. It really hasn't closed, but it's stabilized enough. It's a good gap. The gap is around 3 to 4 seconds from the leader. From Dockery to Soper. There's Soper now entering the oval, while the 11 is on the oval turn 1 and 2. Landon Gilliott will pit, which means that will give the lead back to Luke Dockery. Dockery will have the lead. The gap is still a 4 to 5 second lead. The gap is closing between the leaders, but the 11 is going to have a huge lead over Paige Soper. Will Soper close in time to get the win? 11 minutes left. Let's see where they're going to be. It's a 4-second lead for Luke Dockery. 11 minutes now left, now 10 minutes. You can see it. Watch the lap counter beside Paige Soper right here. It's 3 seconds separating the top 2. But in this section, the 11 is better. what is going to happen? Soper closing the gap. And now, closing the gap is easy, but the hard part is passing the leader. Can Luke Dockery hang on for the final 10 minutes? The gap from Soper is closing in on your leader, and the gap from Chef to Soper is also closing in. It's a 7-second gap. We have also seen great runs. How about Jordan Spencer in position to get a lot of points here? He could be entering his name into the battle for the regular season championship next week. There's a 15. She's still in front of the 1. And the 33 is still in last. 9 minutes left here in Daytona. Luke Dockery looking for career win number 1. The 11's already won a race this year, and that was Nolan Vernango. But that is because Dockery got. But that's because Dockery got suspended. Now here we go. It's still a 2-second lead. I mean, the gap is barely closing. I mean, Luke Dockery is preserving this lead very good here. You can see the 27 behind him, but it's all Luke Dockery. Come to 7 minutes left. Can Dockery get the win? Jordan Spencer. He is 50 points back from the points lead. That's going to be changing tonight. If he continues this good run he's having right... Oh, he has to pit. I was just saying that if he were to continue his good run, that he might be entering the top battle for the points, but he has to pit. Take a look at Matthew Campton running in 7th, running up front all day long. And through the oval turn 3 and 4, the gap really hasn't closed. Luke Dockery has just managed the lead perfectly. Lap 79 is on the board. Lap 79 is on the board. Soper is closing in though, but is closing in slowly. As we are just 7 minutes away from getting the checkered flag. The top 2 have never won a race in their career. And it's a 6-second gap from 2nd to 3rd. On pit road, that's Jordan Spencer. But all eyes remain up front. The gap has closed. Is Dockery's luck running out? Or does he have enough in the tank to make it all the way and hold off Paige Soper? I think Soper has a little bit better tires than your leader. It's less than a second lead now. Here comes Soper. It's still 6 minutes left. Anything can happen in these next 6 minutes. You see 2nd place running right there. Remember, when time runs out, they will hear that it is a white flag, and the next flag will end the race, as your leader maybe has about 3 to 4 laps to go now here from Daytona, and it's a battle now. The battle is on between Dockery and Soper. We will see a first-time winner coming out of the race tonight. Will it be Paige Soper in the 27? She has been abysmal this year. She is near the bottom in the points. She has not been good at all this year. Same as Luke Dockery. And now we have a battle up front. Here comes Soper to the inside. Can't get the run. Paige Soper switched her ride from the 4 to the 27. Remember, Soper ran full time in the Pat Green Motorsports number 4 last season. And she raced part-time a couple seasons ago. She got in the pole. She was fast in that car. And now she has speed today. And maybe a few laps away from maybe passing the leader and getting her first career win. It's like I said, getting to the leader was really easy. And now passing the leader will be tough. Kellen Sheff needs to close the gap within 5. Needs to close the 6-second gap from first to third in 4 minutes. Luke Dockery, lap 81 is on the board. Dockery continues to lead. Here comes Soper to the outside. It's almost side by side, but Dockery is going to clear. Dockery hangs on to the lead. And that is exactly what the 14 wants. He wants the leaders to go side by side and make contact for him to close the gap. 7 tenths, now 6 tenths, and closing on this corner, but it's still not enough for Soper, as it's Luke Dockery looking for his first career win. I think we are near 2 laps to go or the white flag. We are indeed near 2 laps to go. Here comes Dockery. Time is running out. 2 minutes left. Everybody is hearing on the radio. 2 minutes left in this 2-hour sprint from Daytona. Luke Dockery, I don't think was in the talk to win. I don't think he was that fast in practice. But we knew that Paige Soper's long run car was quick, and you can tell how fast her long run car is. I think we're now with 3 laps, either with 3 or 2 laps to go. It's going to be interesting. I think we have 2 to go. I don't know. Contact me. Soper hits the bumper of the 11. The 14 is still not able to close back in. Time is running out. I think when they cross the line, I think that's when they will give the white flag. It depends on when time runs out. Here comes Soper. Soper now getting a good run to the inside, can't get the run. If they cross the line before time runs out, that's going to be the white flag. If not, this is the final lap. It's going to be very interesting. I think it's going to be close. Time is running out. 1 minute left in the race. I think they have 1 lap left when they cross the line. Soper to the inside. You can tell how aggressive she is being. Yes, the leaders are hearing on their radio right now that they are getting the white flag this time by. So for one final time at the Daytona road course, white flag is in the air. One more time around Daytona. 1 lap to go in Daytona. Here comes Soper. She is able to get the good run. She's able to be within 5/10. Now it's going to be interesting. Can she make that run up here in the final few corners? Luke Dockery knows that this is his shot to win. It's a 6/10 of a second lead. It's a bigger gap from the last lap. And now here comes the 27. She's sending it in. Can't make it happen. Dockery continues to lead. This 11 team and Luke Dockery has not had the luck. He's been terrible. And he's gotten suspended multiple times for being a threat on the racetrack. Not a winning threat, but a threat to cause wrecks. Luke Dockery trying to beat those allegations today. Through the bus stop for the final time. Finally, he is going to be celebrating. Finally, his fans have something to celebrate about. You know what? He's going to the playoffs. No points needed. Luke Dockery is going to win in Daytona, and he is locking himself into the championship race. Dockery holds off Soper and is going to win at Daytona. First career win for Luke Dockery. Pit stops happen real well. And now, let's see, where did everybody finish? Winston finishes 18th. Horner, 22nd. In front of Jordan Spencer. We know that the time that the 15 ran inside the top 10, that is points for her. She might be able to close back in. But we are not seeing another multi-time winner tonight. We are seeing a first-time winner. Dockery wins.